We now turn our attention to the latest in the Ukraine-Russia war. Well, days after a fiery clash in the Oval Office upended the US-Ukraine ties, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has said that West is at a crossroads in history and now is the time to act. As Europe moves to take control of negotiations over the war away from the US and present a united front where a UK-French-led peace plan could be created and offered and presented to the US. Well, despite the meltdown between Washington and Kyiv, Zelensky said he believed he could salvage his relationship with Donald Trump after Friday's shouting match. But that talks would have to take place behind closed doors. This report explains the details of what that plan may look like.
A war raging for 3 years, a divided West, and now a high-stakes summit that could decide Ukraine's future.
Through my discussions over recent days, we've agreed that the UK, France and others will work with Ukraine on a plan to stop the fighting.
It's now of utmost importance to step up the defence investment for a prolonged period of time.
UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced a 4-point plan, a blueprint to end the war and protect Ukraine from future Russian attacks. Starmer has announced Coalition of the Willing, a core group of nations led by the UK and France, pledging military aid, economic pressure on Russia, and guarantees for Ukraine's security. The US isn't part of this coalition yet, but Europe wants Washington on board. This summit follows a fierce showdown between Zelensky and Trump at the White House, exposing deep cracks over Ukraine. UK PM Keir Starmer has said that first the UK must keep military aid flowing and increase pressure on Russia. Second, any peace deal must guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty, with Kyiv directly at the table. Third, Starmer wants Ukraine's defences strengthened to prevent future invasions. And fourth, he called for a coalition of the willing, countries that will guarantee the peace deal and defend Ukraine afterwards.
The purpose of today's meeting was to unite our partners around this effort, to strengthen Ukraine and to support a just and enduring peace for the good of all of us.
The UK is backing its promise with £1.6 billion to buy over 5,000 air defence missiles, on top of a £2.2 billion loan funded by profits from frozen Russian assets. Starmer warned against any weak deal that Russia can easily break, saying Europe must leave, but US support is essential. Leaders from France, Germany, Poland, Sweden, Turkey and Canada, alongside the EU chief and NATO head, attended the summit. EU chief Ursula von der Leyen warned that Europe urgently needs to rearm and loosen budget rules to fund defence. The big question: can Starmer's coalition unite Europe, bring Trump on side and secure peace without handing victory to Moscow? With Rhythm Arcadia, Bureau Report, NDTV World.
Okay, so what is really the plan that Europe has when it comes to addressing, ending the entire conflict? Is the questions, in fact, we pose today. One is that will Europe actually deter Russia without US support? Remember, this was a question that Trump asked Starmer last week, that what are you going to do against Russia? And that question is still valid with no adequate answers. The second key question that I pose is that does Europe have defense capabilities to actually meet Kyiv's needs? Remember, it asked for $250 billion from Keir Starmer and it got $2.5 billion. All of it was not defense, some of it was also reconstructive aid for reconstruction. The third question that I'm putting tonight is, can Europe actually trust Trump? Which way is this going to go is going to depend on the trust factor between the two allies, and it seems that it's going through a bit of a crisis. Okay, let's get in Nicholas Nugent joining me from London, and Sophie Fullerton, who's Professor of Politics at the Fordham University as well. Sophie, let me give you the first word here. We put out those questions, which I think really sets the agenda for why we are having this conversation. The fact is, Europe may show its outrage, it may show its solidarity but it doesn't have much to show when it comes to numbers on the board as to how it wants to defend Ukraine.
So the biggest issue here is if Russia wins this in relation to the invasion of Ukraine, we're going to see Russia at the rest of Europe's door. So this is the big fear that Europe has at this point. So they don't really have a choice at this point than to step up and take charge where the US is choosing to lead from behind. In relation to the question as to whether Europe can trust the US has been one of their longest allies, but it's continued to prove these past few weeks that it's going to move towards the helm of Russia and put our allies to the side. So from what I'm seeing, they want to continue to trust the US, but it's yet to be seen as to whether that trust can be had as Trump and his administration continues to push more towards Russian policy interests.
All right. Let me get Nicholas as well on the broadcast. Nicholas, how do you feel about the UK-France solidarity? You have 17 other partners who were there together with the Ukraine. But what they're trying to make up, whether it comes to solidarity, they're losing out in terms of actual numbers. And I think that's really the story, isn't it?
Well, let's start by saying that I think the answer to your question about whether Europe can trust the US is it has to trust the US, because Europe can't go it alone, whatever going it means. Because I'm finding a lot of confusion at the moment as to whether we're looking for a peace, a solution, an end to the war, or whether we're bunching together to arm Ukraine even more. And I think even those who took part in yesterday's important meeting didn't really know what they were doing, didn't really know where they were heading. Because on the one hand, Mr. Trump talks a lot about peace, but appears only to be dealing with one side. That's to say, he's shown his antagonism towards Kyiv, towards Ukraine, but he has been talking to the Russian leader. Europe is friendly towards Kyiv and backing President Zelensky, as yesterday's meeting showed, but it doesn't yet seem to be talking to Russia. So I'm very confused. Was this a bunch yesterday of those supporting Ukraine in this conflict, or were they genuinely heading for peace? You talk about a 4-point peace plan, but where is the plan? Because you can't have a peace plan unless you're talking to both sides, and I've seen no evidence that the European group, let's call them NATO without the United States, because that's what was meeting yesterday.
Yeah, that's what they are, yes.
Without the United States, but they're not talking to Russia. So it's a very, very confusing situation, I think.
Indeed. Sophie, how do we respond to what Nicholas just said? And it's a very valid point that Europe is trying to make up for the fact that A, there's no US in it, B, that they are not having any lines of communication with Russia. How do you resolve a conflict without speaking to one of the two parties?
I agree in the sense that Europe needs the US, especially there's been conversation about boots on the ground. Well, you can't do that without US backing. I'll go back to what I said previously as to whether the US is willing to do that. It's yet to be seen. This administration is very wiggy in relation to how they go about their foreign policy. And we've seen the Trump administration continue to move more towards a pro-Russia policy. The Kremlin and Putin are not going to be okay with any types of boots on the ground, especially if it's being backed by the US. So again, it's to be seen as to whether this can be a coalition that also includes the US. But as I've said previously, whether the US is going to be able to come in and be a leader within this, Europe has no other choice but to move forward with or without the US. What I also want to say, which I find really interesting.
Sophie, I want to interrupt you here there just to sort of, put one more thing in perspective, which is that the US under Trump administration is very clear that they will not have any boots on ground. And Mr. Starmer clarified that they will have boots on ground only when the US is on board. So what are we really trying to achieve here by not moving forward?
So it's this push and pull that we're seeing, right? Starmer has also said that we need to have the US at the table when it comes to these types of negotiations, and that we're willing to and continuing to wanting to work with the US to get a specific type of deal, to see some type of peace. What I was going to say too, which I think is really interesting here, is you're starting to see other countries come to the table that haven't had a seat. As the US continues to pull more from behind, we're starting to see countries like Turkey, for example, that are at this meeting when the US isn't. And what does that mean for foreign policy relations within Europe, and who's going to be the one really leading these types of coalitions?